name is Kathy, and in today's video I'm going to be making up some chicken broth. So what I have in my pot here, I had 4 chicken carcasses. They've been sitting in my freezer. I needed to get them out so I could make room. And these were just carcass. I had found a really good deal on chicken one day. So I bought a bunch of chickens, I cut them all up, got them canned, and then I threw the carcasses in the freezer because I wasn't ready to make broth right then. So now I'm ready, and so what I've done is I pulled the carcasses out of the freezer. I went ahead and roasted them up just so that the broth would have that nice roasted chicken flavor. And so there in my pot, I've added a little bit of water. Now to this, I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. I'm going to add in 5 chicken feet. I know that sounds really weird, but they just give the broth a nice gelatinous texture, and they're just full of yummy nutrition. So those are going in. Now in my freezer, when I cut up onions or I have pieces of leftover celery, I just take them and throw them in the freezer. And then when I'm ready for to make broth, I just add those right into my pot. Now I will have to say that when I cut up my onions, I do give the outside of the onion a bit of a wash. That way when the skins go into the bag in the freezer, they've already been pre-washed. So when I bring them out and throw them into my stock, I don't have to worry about there being any dirt or anything on the onions. I also have a couple of carrots that were in my refrigerator that had been in there just a little bit too long. They weren't mushy or anything. They just were, past the time that I would use them in a fresh meal. So those get to go into the pot as well. So now all we're going to do is cover this with filtered water. Now I'm using the water out of my refrigerator because it's filtered, but if you don't have access to filtered water, don't let that stop you from making your own chicken stock. It will turn out just fine if you use the sink water. You don't need to complicate it, and don't let that stop you from making your own chicken stock, because it really is so much more delicious than the store-bought, and it's much better for you as well. Okay, so that is everything that we need to put in the pot. We don't need to add any salt or pepper. I did put a little bit of salt and pepper on my chicken carcasses when I went to cook them, just so that the skins that were left would have a little bit of flavor to them, a little bit more flavor to them. But now all we're going to do is turn this on low. And now this is going to sit and simmer for 2 to 3 days. So it does take a little while to cook, but that slow cookedness, it'll bring all of the marrow out of the bones, and just break down those bones and make a very nice rich broth. So when this is all done, I'll bring you back. Okay, we're back. All right, it's been 3 days for me. But only a couple seconds for you. So here, let me show you what we got going on. In our roaster here, we have our chicken stock, and now we are ready to get this strained out, and then I'll show you what different options you have for storing it and preserving it for long term. So first, I'm going to get all of this into my pot here. What I have, it's just a pasta pot, so it has it's a pot inside of a pot. This one has holes in it. Inside of that, I've put some cheesecloth just to try to get as many of the little things out of it as I can. You can do this with, a bowl and a wire mesh strainer, or, a different kind of pot and a strainer. Anything that you have to use, it'll work just fine. And I also want to mention that, so I made this with this big roaster. This is a 22-quart roaster. I used 4 chicken carcasses, a big bag of leftover like onion peels and onion pieces, and celery and some carrot. I also, after I turned off the camera last time, I went ahead and added some garlic cloves to it. I think about 7 garlic cloves. Again, this is a very large pot. This is the first time that I'm making it in the roaster. Before this, for years, I just made it in a crock pot. So you can make this with as much or as little as you want. So if you're using a crock pot, you probably just only use maybe 1 turkey carcass and maybe just an onion and a couple of stalks of celery and some carrot. The time before this, I did do it on my stove, but since it takes 2 to 3 days, at least I like to do it for 2 to 3 days, you can cut it off at after 24 hours if you just want a light broth. I like it to go longer so that I get all that the good bone marrow out, and it makes it more like a bone broth. That's what I like to do. And the last time I did it in a big pot, just a big stew pot on my stove, it took a few days, and I really wasn't comfortable leaving. I have a gas stove, so I wasn't comfortable with having the gas on for the full 3 days. So I think I only did it for 2 days that time, but it made me uncomfortable. So I now have a roaster so that I can do the bigger batches, and I feel more confident in doing it this way. But if all you have is just a crock pot, then use just a crock pot. I did that for years, and it worked great. Okay, let's get this going. I think I'm going to try to just dump it. Wish me luck. I don't think this got out as much of the little bits as I would have liked, but that's okay. I can strain it for a second time after this next step. So now what you're going to have is your batch of broth, and it's going to be pretty oily. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this oil separator. I'm just going to pour some broth into that without making too much of a mess. Okay, that's good. Okay, so now I'll just let this sit, and so it separates, and this is a pretty neat little cup here. It just has a little lever on the side, and it's actually going to drain it from the bottom so that I leave all the oil in. So I'm going to let this sit for a minute, and while I talk to you about some more options here. So you could also put this into some containers and put it in the refrigerator, and then once it in the refrigerator, once it cools, all of the oil should go to the top and harden, and then you can just skim that off, and you can actually use that oil in cooking, or toss it out, however you want to do it. But then you'd be left with your stock without the oil. And once you separate that out, there's some different ways you can store this. So one option is to can it. If you can it, you would do, you just fill your jars, leave 1 inch of headspace, and for your pints, you're going to process those for 20 minutes, and for your quarts, you're going to process those for 25 minutes. And that's with a pressure canner. So in the US, we have pressure canners. They're readily available. That's how you would do it. Now, if you are watching this video from a country that doesn't allow pressure canners, the water bath time on these would be 180 minutes. So you would water bath can it for 180 minutes. And I got that time out of this little, it's your guide to home canning. It was put out by Kerr in 1938, I believe. I believe that says 1938. So this is just a very old little book that they put out, and it has canning times. It includes canning times for water bath canning and also for pressure canning. So according to this little book, your water bath time would be 180 minutes. Something to keep in mind. So when you're canning, it's all about the temperature, the internal temperature of your food, and the length of time you leave it at that temperature. We pressure can because with pressure equals heat. So you're able to have a higher temperature achieved with the pressure, so you can leave your food in the canner for a shorter amount of time. And that helps. Who wants to eat green beans that have been being canned for 180 minutes? They'd probably be pretty mushy by the end of that time. And who wants to sit there and wait that long? So for us that are fortunate enough to have a pressure canner, use your pressure canner. USDA sets our time for the pressure canner because they test all of that out to find out how, at what time does it that the internal temperature of our food reach the proper temperature, and how long does it need to be maintained to make sure all of those the nasty little buggy things are killed. So there you go. There are your times if you choose to can your chicken stock after you've made it. Another option is to dehydrate it and turn it into powder. So here I have, see that? I turned some of it into powder. Yesterday what I did is I took some of the broth out of the pot, and what I have these silicone little mat things. I believe they're for making like jelly rolls. They have a little bit of a lip on them, and so I just put this on my dehydrator tray. I poured broth in on the silicone mat, and that way it had the little lip. It would hold it in. I did fill it while it was at in my dehydrator so that I wouldn't have to try to carry it, because I'm sure I'd spill it all over the place. When I did it, I just did a little bit in the tray, and so it didn't cover the full tray because I was concerned that it wouldn't dry in time, so I just did a little bit just to see how it would work. And the silicone tray worked great. It dried perfectly. As you can see, I was able to make powder with it. That's now shelf stable. I can put it in a jar and put it on my in my pantry shelf. It was very difficult to get it off of this silicone tray It may have been because I didn't have it thick enough. I didn't have enough there, and so it was just a very thin layer once it dried. So I think I'm going to try that again with some of this stock that I have, and I'll put in more, and then just let it go for as long as it needs to go to dry. And then I think I'll also try one with maybe putting some parchment paper on the bottom of it, so that I can just lift out the parchment paper. Maybe it'll be easier to come off the parchment paper. So I'm going to give that a try, but dehydrating it and grinding it up in your blender to make a powder is another option for storing your broth, especially if you don't have a lot of room. Then you would just rehydrate it. I think it's about, you do like a tablespoon of powder broth to 1 cup of water, of hot water. But then you can make it as weak, as strong as you want. Just add more powder if you want it to be a little bit stronger. But that's another good option. Now another option is to just take your jars of broth and put them right in your freezer. You can just freeze your broth in your canning jars, and then when you're wanting to use it, bring it out. You will need to let it thaw before you use it, but that is another option. If you don't want to can it, you don't have a pressure canner to be able to can it, you can put it in jars or any other container that you have. It doesn't have to be a canning jar. I guess you could do plastic, or maybe just an empty like mayonnaise jar or something like that. Just want to make sure it's a nice thick jar, because you don't want it to break in the freezer. And I would also suggest, don't fill it too full when you do that, because you want to leave room for expansion for when it freezes, and you don't want it to like pop off the top or anything. Maybe leave the lid on really loose until it's frozen, and then cinch down your lid and put it back in. That way you don't have a chance of it expanding so much that it breaks your jar. Another option is to pour the broth into ice cube trays, freeze these, and then you just pop out the cubes, throw them into a freezer bag, and then they're ready for whenever you want to use them. So if you're just needing a little bit of broth in something, you just pop out the pull out the bag of ice cubes and use those in your meal, or if you're just wanting to make a mug of broth, this is another great way of storing it. Okay. So as you can, I don't know if you can see this, but our broth has separated. The oil is at the top. Let's show you how this works. Hopefully you can see this okay. So as you see, the oil is at the top. I'm just going to push the button on the side, and now my broth is coming out from the bottom, leaving the oil in my oil separator here. Okay, and there we have it. Nice, rich chicken broth. Okay, well, I hope you found today's video helpful. I hope this inspires you to maybe try to start setting aside some of those things like your bones and your veggie scraps that you would just normally throw away. I hope this encourages you to set those aside, throw them in the freezer, and then once you have enough, try your hand at making some yummy chicken or beef or even ham broth. It's a great way to put nutritious food on your pantry shelf for virtually nothing, because it would be things that you would have been throwing away anyways. So you could have yourself a nice big pot of chicken stock or beef stock without putting out any extra money and without having to go to the store and buy it. If you liked today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed to my channel, please be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon to be notified each time I put out a new video. And until next time, I hope you have an amazing day, and we'll see you on the next video.